you so much. And welcome to our panel. Thank you guys for choosing to spend this morning with us. So this was originally imagined to be a 4-person panel. However, Dr. Tina Menendez, who conceptualized and helped organize this panel, was unable to join us today. I do, however, want to thank Tina for her guidance and her inspiration, and most importantly, for always inviting us to think critically and capaciously about the term community and its impact on our work. My name is Jennifer Garcon. I'm the curator for modern and contemporary special collections at Princeton University, where I collect, curate, and care for special collections rare books, manuscripts, visual art, and born digital material from the 20th century onward. At Princeton, I've been working to develop post-custodial collecting processes that rethink traditional custodial and stewardship models in ways that recognize and reckon with the neo-colonial origins of the field. I'm also a member of Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia, an association of activist archivists who are advancing anti-racist and anti-oppression practices in the field. And am the community archiving lead on a project called Remember Black Philadelphia, which is trying to document the displacement of Philadelphia's historic Black communities by creating archives that capture and preserve the rich cultural and lived experience of Black diasporic folks in the city, all as a way to challenge the erasure of gentrification. And so my work has really been focused around centering under and undocumented archival voices in the cultural record, and creating opportunities for collaborative and co-partnered projects that elevate such voices and experiences. And I owe a great debt to this work in having cut my teeth in the cultural heritage space in Miami, where I am a board member of Diaspora Vibe Cultural Arts Incubator, and at HistoryMiami, where I had the pleasure of growing and learning alongside my 2 co-panelists, Hana and Suarmis, while working there in collection development and later as an assistant curator. So I'm going to take this time to introduce my wonderful co-panelists, and then we will engage kind of in a facilitated conversation, and then open it up for discussion and questions. So Hana Squires is the manager of education programs, access, and community engagement at HistoryMiami Museum. She develops and manages the education department's public programs for youth and adult audiences, including its city tours, programming, and outreach initiatives for youth and family audiences. As the museum's ADA coordinator, Hana collaborates with all departments on the museum's accessibility initiatives, best practices, and requirements. She connects with the public to ensure that all visitors are able to experience and engage with the museum's exhibitions and programs without barriers. Hana believes in centering people's experiences and leading with empathy throughout her work. Hana studied history and anthropology at the University of Miami and has been with HistoryMiami Museum since 2014. So Suarmis Travieso is the Assistant Director of Education at HistoryMiami Museum. She was born in Havana, Cuba, and at a young age, Suarmis showed an interest in talent for the arts. She began dancing at the age of 3, and by 5 was performing in theaters all around Havana. In 1997, her family left Cuba and came to the United States and eventually settled in Miami, Florida. Following her love for the arts, Suarmis visited museums around the US, first for several school projects, and later at her leisure. She found that it was at museums that she felt the most happy. After graduating from Florida International University with a BA in Arts and Humanities and a minor in Art History in 2003, she went on to earn an MA in History in 2010. It was while working as an intern at the Miami Art Museum, which is now known as the Perez Art Museum, Suarmis was first exposed to museum education, changing her career trajectory. She pursued a second master's degree, this time in museum education, and began her career at HistoryMiami Museum in Miami, Florida. So she truly believes that museums can ignite curiosity and creativity in all ages. And in addition, that they help us to understand the past in hopefully ways that create a better future. So Miami is a really interesting place to be.
I don't know which one is Hana.
Oh, so Hana and Suarmis.
I'm Suarmis Travieso.
Hana Squires.
Yeah, so Miami is, I think, a really interesting place to be in the glam space and to be doing cultural heritage work. It frequently touts itself as being the gateway to Latin America and the Caribbean, and shares some of the nuances and challenges with spaces that exist in the Caribbean basin. Arguably, perhaps more so than some of its nearest northern neighbors, states like Georgia and Alabama, for instance. And so these challenges, I think, were really wonderfully articulated by Shawnee and Terry in the keynote. And I think Miami touches upon some of the same factors that they described, right? So histories of colonialism and imperialism, political and social strife, racism, classism, dictatorship, migration, tourism. And most recently, sea level rise as a result of climate change, climate gentrification, and the systematic displacement of historic cultural communities. And here I'm very pointedly talking about what's happening right now in Little Haiti and Little Havana, which I think we'll get into a little bit. And so by way of introduction, I wanna kind of invite my panelists to share a little bit about the cultural heritage landscape in Miami, specifically as it relates to museums, libraries, archives, and other kind of cultural institutions, and to characterize the changes that they have perhaps seen in the last 5 to 10 years in this regard.
So thank you, Jen, for the introduction. When people think of Miami, actually, let's start by saying so much of Miami essentially is influenced by the Caribbean, South and Central America. And when people think of Miami, they think of this wonderful place full of beaches and fantastic nightlife. But what most people don't know is that Miami's history dates back to over 10,000 years. We have history that goes back to prehistoric times. Since its inception, Miami is known as a place that people just come to call it home. From different places, from different countries, whether it's migrant or through immigration. It is a unique place compared with the rest of the United States. It houses a multitude of cultural backgrounds, traditions, languages, foodways, etc. And somehow all these differences have come together to represent what Miami is today to the rest of the world, and somehow they make it work.
And in terms of Miami's cultural heritage, it has several cultural organizations that reflect different parts of Miami's many identities. So HistoryMiami Museum, for instance, is one of the oldest museums in Miami and was founded a little over 80 years ago. Historically, the museum had collected and preserved the history of South Florida and the Caribbean, though today its mission is to share Miami stories to foster learning, inspire a sense of place, and cultivate an engaged community. And over the past 5 to 10 years, more and more areas within Greater Miami and its municipalities have built their own cultural institutions that serve our communities. More recently, HistoryMiami Museum, like many museums across the globe, have made an intentional shift to become more reflective and responsive to our community's needs and the stories that we center and share. So these changes can be seen not only in what stories are told on the walls of our museum spaces, but also in how these exhibitions are interpreted through our education programs.
So in thinking about how one might create resonance, not only for current, but for future audiences, one of the things that I think is really important is reckoning with how things have been done in the past. And one of the things, arguably, that I can say is Miami's Haitian community, for example, its Nicaraguan and Venezuelan communities, have been doing the work of developing and promoting its own cultural institutions, as you, Hannah, suggests, in significant ways, which suggests to me that they're in some ways trying to correct or redress a significant omission in the existing evolutionary narratives of the place, right, of Miami as this city. And And so I want us to think a little bit about how the history of Miami more broadly, and I think we can extrapolate outward and think about this as being South Florida, is told historically. HistoryMiami Museum is at its core a history museum, right? So within that concept, who emerges as the center, as the kind of central characters in the versions of history in South Florida that communities are kind of reckoning with?
Like many museums in the past, HistoryMiami historically has told history through the lens of those in power, whether it was political, capital, social power. When I started the museum 13 years ago now, our school programs, for example, essentially was told through that lens. And you will always hear names like Brickles, Julia Tuttle, Henry Flagler. However, in the past 7 years or so, we've made a shift. Not to correct the story, because it's not to say that the story was incorrect, but to essentially include all the stories that were missing from the main narrative. For example, our school program now goes beyond just what's on the text panels and includes stories like Bahamian immigrant Maria Brown, who essentially was an important founder of Coconut Grove. We include stories of women like Paulina Pedroso, who influenced South Florida's history as one of the most prominent female leaders in the Cuban War of Independence. Those stories are not necessarily in our wall text panels, but we make the effort to include them in the conversation as we walk through the spaces.
And there was definitely a lot of learning and unlearning that needed to happen at our museum. It was always the practice of the education department to be reflective of our work, but this deeper introspection had to occur. So what stories were missing and why? Where could we decenter this historically dominant narrative we were sharing to tell a more comprehensive story of Miami's layered history and the people who contributed to it? So this was something that we intentionally started to weave throughout our work over the past 7 years and continue to do.
So I think I'm kind of speaking from the kind of curatorial side, and I think I can extrapolate this outward a little bit to other similar museums who have similar foundings, right? So evolving from historical societies, developing as a result of kind of personal collections. It feels a little bit like part of the omission is conditioned within the objects, the items, the archives that come into spaces, these kind of small museum spaces, right? So many collections were built, at least primarily through donation or donor relationships, meaning that the relationship and the leadership structures mattered in terms of the kinds of stories that are and can be privileged in spaces like this. And so with resources and endowment, there's an opportunity to be more capacious with collections. But this too presents a problem given the extractive nature of museums kind of historically. And so this is where I think I want to have us talk about and think about the work of education departments in particular, which is where I think there can be some nuance to thinking about these particular narratives, right? So through engagement, it seems like there's an opportunity to combat the status quo in pursuit of elevating inclusive narratives and histories. All of this is to say, however, that I'm sometimes a bit concerned when I hear terms like community being used as a sort of catch-all. Arguably, I think this happens really often in a field that I'm most familiar with, which is kind of archival and library special collection spaces, where it's meant to refer to anything outside of the dominant institutional structure, right? So it's used as a reference to some kind of fictive or imagined authenticity that exists outside of institutions in some really, I think, problematic ways. And so I think it's really imperative that we spend a little bit of time as part of this discussion thinking about, within the context of HistoryMiami, how it then defines the communities that it's thinking about operating in, with, and within.
So we define communities, regardless of size, as not only those who are connected geographically within a particular space and place, but also through commonalities such as shared histories, languages, religions, identities. People are tethered together in so many different ways. And so it could be someone who lived in a space for only a short time, but still feels a deep connection to that place that was once home, and community with someone who had lived there for over 50 years.
Some people think that museums as entities of knowledge and power should be welcome wherever we go. Meaning folks within spaces or within communities should be happy to have us there and just give us a sit at the table and essentially listen to us. We don't think that's the case. We think that to build relationships, we have to go to the communities. We have to be able to listen. Those relationships essentially should work both ways. It takes time, it takes work to develop a relationship, even if it's only within a superficial level. It takes time to get to know one another. And I think that as museums, we need to learn to listen to our communities. Essentially, we serve those communities. So it is important that we learn to listen and that we do our best to strive and connect with those around us. Over the past 7 years, we have built, I'm gonna call them just passages or ways or whatnot to provide access to the community around us. We created a family pass that allows for 4 people to get free admission to the museum. So everywhere we go, we essentially distribute this. And this pass has no expiration date. So you can come visit us whenever you want, whenever you're able, whether it's this month, next year, or 3 years from now. We will still take in the community pass and we will allow free access. In addition to that, we did a geographical study about 2 years ago, and we started to look at those, not just those who come to us, but those that don't come to us. And we did our best to try to figure out a way into getting to those communities. And thinking that sometimes museums are not welcome, then we essentially leverage existing relationships that we have with the local library system or with the Parks and Recreation system. So the picture that's right behind me is an outreach that we did, I'd like to say was 2021, in which we activated 3 park locations around Miami-Dade County. So we did an activation in North Miami, Central Miami area, and South, all at the same time. We partnered with Jackson Hospital to provide resources. This was during the time of the pandemic. On top of that, we partnered with Parks and Rec to essentially bring people to spaces in a time which being indoors was seen as a problem. So we were completely outdoors. So we created close to 2,000 backpacks with resources, with information about History Miami, with the things that we had available, school resources, our virtual programs, with Play-Doh, with fidgets, with craft activities, with coloring sheets that the museum delivered. And essentially, a drive-by went by us, and we placed bags in people's trunks, people's vehicles, and distribute simultaneously at 3 different locations around Miami-Dade County. In addition to that, we also support, is it there? Yeah, I got it right. Local festivals. So community festivals where there are in our area or north of us or south of us. That's one of the outreach tables at a local festival recently, about 6 months ago. So we take our collection into these spaces, not the real artifacts, replicas, and essentially engage with younger audiences. And so they're able to touch and connect with the items, and then hopefully they'll come back to us using a family pass or at a free day or whatnot, and be able to engage with the museum.
I think one of the things that's really, that I appreciate in the ways that you've framed how you approach community is that there seems to be a flexibility in approach that recognizes that there is no monolithic community kind of more broadly, but also secondly, that you acknowledge that there's a labor to partnership building, right? So the notion that you come in and think that, of course, we are these stakeholders and realize that no, in fact, in working with community, there's a sense of trust that needs to be earned over time in order for any partnership to kind of get off the ground, right? And so there's a particular labor in doing that work. And so it really resonates with the work that I do and the ways that I want to think about kind of historical posterity and preservation, namely that is necessarily collaborative, but that there is it's also about resource allocation and scarcity in some significant ways, wherein institutions can partner with communities in ways that redress in certain ways. And so I want to think about our work in part as being one that creates structures within institutions that invites in rather than shuts out broader voices and broader stakeholders who are thought of as partners in developing historical records, right? And I think what's at stake in the way that you describe it is continuing to have a one-sided history, right? If we are too uncomfortable with being uncomfortable with reckoning with the reasons why this is so, right? This is why I think it's really interesting that the work that you guys do, and in particular, the work that you imagine to do, is moving outside of the walls of the museum itself. And I think this goes back a little bit to the keynote where we're talking about spaces versus buildings, and how to reimagine kind of spaces in a way that's inclusive. And how the flexibility of term is important there. And so I want to shift the conversation a little slightly and to talk about kind of the central work of museums, right? A lot of people think of it as being really rooted in curation, but having worked at HistoryMiami and worked with the education department, I think there's kind of an essential component that education departments in particular play in any museum's curatorial mission. Exhibitions can be beautifully curated and no one comes, right? And so the work, I think, of education departments becomes crucial therein because you have this important task of introducing new audiences to exhibits, to the space, finding multiple angles and opportunities to activate the museum space, and creating greater context with the museum's mission. And here, I think I want to ask you to reflect a little bit about your approach here, and thinking about the activities that you have created and launched, and how they're seen to function as expanding and enhancing engagement in ways that happen both inside of the museums and its four walls, but also outside in kind of the broader South Florida communities.
We have a gallery tour of our permanent exhibition called Making Miami Home. This tour in particularly explores the stories of the different people who have called Miami home. It's just like its title. However, the stories included in these tours are not the stories in the text panel. So we use the exhibition as a space, but we include all the other stories that somehow didn't make it into the main story. And throughout the tour, which is a 2-hour program, and it's available for all ages from the kindergarten all the way to the adult, depending on the audience. We essentially focus on all those stories that when the exhibition was originally built, a permanent exhibition was built in the early 1980s. So when it was originally built, somehow didn't make it to that main story. In addition to that, we host regular weekend tours of all of our exhibitions, and we allowed our museum educators to interpret these spaces, not just using the historical context, but using their own lens, driven by their personal experiences and by their personal expertise, whether that's anthropology or history or art. Picture right behind me. It's one of our museum educators leading a tour in our permanent exhibition, Tropical Dreams. Right next to it's an ASL interpreter, so we do offer ASL interpreters in the majority of our programs, even if they haven't been requested. That's a gallery tour of during our free family funded.
And so in thinking about all of the audiences we serve, we also want to ensure that we are eliminating barriers in our museum so that we are accessible to people of all abilities. And so this is an image of a young child in our sensory room, and they are engaging with a light table. Our museum, you know, inside of the building at least, there are limitations to space. And so we have a flexible theater space that we, reimagine and create into a sensory room. And so the lights are dimmed. We have adaptive tools and, different types of seating and different ways to engage and experience the museum so that people can come on a, Sunday morning and engage with us the way that they feel comfortable doing. And so we have this space set aside, and it takes us 3 days to set up, but it is well worth it. And this did not take place in a vacuum. So in 2018, Suarmis and I developed our sensory backpacks because we noticed that there was a need for people who have, sensory sensitivities, whether they are on the autism spectrum or have cognitive disabilities. And so it was a portable toolkit that families could check out for free to carry with them throughout our exhibition spaces. In developing this, we worked with people with disabilities and also people who were disability advocates or parents of children on the autism spectrum to really give us feedback in what should be included in these toolkits, how heavy they could be, what, how to engage with them, how to tell the public and the communities that we have this available. And then just this last fall, we expanded on that program to create our Sensory Sundays. And so now we are twice a year, free to the public on a select Sunday morning where we are open 2 hours earlier to have our museum set up in a sensory inclusive environment where the lights are dimmed in some areas, the AV may be lowered or turned off. We have sensory signage that is now going to be permanent when we get back, hopefully. And so to just really help set expectations for visitors, really try to create that sensory inclusive environment so that everyone can participate.
So you've talked a little bit about how inside of the museum space you've been able to engage in this work, but I want to invite you to think about and to talk about a little bit what that looks like outside of the four walls of the museum. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Definitely. So History Miami has a city tours program series, and it's been around for over 30 years now. And so it offers participants an opportunity to engage with the history and cultures of Miami through walking tours, boat tours, and coach tour experiences. And so, although, of course, a lot of museums around Miami are really dependent on tourism, what's special about our city tours programs are that so much of our audience are locals who are looking to engage with our history and learn about the different communities in Miami. And so historically, our city tours were led by the museum's resident historian. And while some opportunities arose for residents to engage with the tour participants to highlight their own history and communities and stories, it wasn't a central part of the program development. And so when I came on as the city tours manager in 2017, we made an intentional shift to deepen this work and diversify who was interpreting the history of these neighborhoods, what stories were being told, and how we were engaging with local stakeholders to tell their own stories. So this took a lot of relationship building, whether it was deepening existing relationships the museum had or reaching out and developing new ones. And so this is an image of a Coconut Grove walking tour with a community stakeholder, J.S. Rashid. And so we learned from him how, his journey to calling the area of Coconut Grove home. He was, I think I met him during the pandemic, and this was, over several meetings, getting to know one another, getting to know his story, seeing how he wanted to engage with us, And so he is here with our local American football team, the Miami Dolphins, sharing that story. On the same tour, we engaged with our Bahamas Junkanoo with the late band leader Langston Longley. And so we enjoyed that Junkanoo performance. That was great. And then, and also, how do we create space for our staff members as well? And so Sudelka, seen here in Little Haiti, was a museum educator, and he had an interest in learning how to engage with folks on city tours outside of the museum's walls. And so we created space for him to lead these tours of his community and supported development. And now he, has become a multicultural tourism ambassador and develops his own tours of his neighborhood in Little Haiti. And here is an image of a tour group at the Little Haiti Cultural Center, and they are participating in compa dance lessons with Sunny. And so we, hope to invest in and engage with communities in all different ways. And so this was one of them. And then more recently, we embarked on a youth photography fellowship that we co-created with local photographer Woosler Dallas Ford in Little Haiti. And so here he is, providing guidance on how to photograph and document the youth who are participating in this cohort's communities. And so we are here in Little Haiti learning about light and shadow.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting about the city tours in particular is the notion that they can be co-curated spaces outside of museum walls, and that there is an open invitation to members, to kind of central catalysts in the communities that you're working with to collaboratively develop programs that speak to not only the history, but also kind of the present and the future as imagined by voices that are really kind of rooted in the places where these tours happen. And I think that we would be remiss to not talk about the challenges that they themselves face, right? So, museums, and in particular, museum spaces in Miami, are imagined to be kind of these elite-centered institutions. And we are, I think, pre-pandemic, certainly, but absolutely post-pandemic, really dealing with a challenge in terms of high wealth and income culture that is really pricing people out in ways that really challenge the diversity of the space in really kind of important ways. So I wanted to kind of invite you guys to think about how the challenges of resource scarcity, particularly those that are amplified in Miami, given the nature of the culture and the high cost of living, and how you guys are thinking about where your work is positioned in that space amongst your co-curators, right, amongst your partners.
So whenever possible, our programs are free for visitors. Our sensory backpacks are free to use throughout the museum. Our sensory Sundays are free for families to enjoy. History Miami's oldest ongoing program is our free Family Night Fun Day, and it's been around since 2002. And this programming particularly essentially creates activities throughout the museum, and activities that you don't regularly see at a museum. So we do from cooking classes all the way to soccer games. We have been blessed with this huge plaza in between both of our buildings that we tend to transform into a playground, into a stadium, into a hockey rink. In a program like this, you come into our museum and you get a gallery tour, you get a multitude of craft activities, you have some sort of hands-on situation, whether it's with a discovery table, whether we have 10 to 15 different types of building blocks, whether they're floor blocks or blocks that go on tables. You get to experience things like incredible foam, which is the particular type of Play-Doh. You get to see performances, you get to have music classes, dance classes. So it's curated in a way that essentially allows visitors to discover all the things the museum can offer in a very informal manner. And this program is free and is offered every single month. So we do our best whenever we can to give back to the community in instances like this. In addition to that, oh, there we go. I forgot to mention the picture. So This happens to be a picture of me facilitating a story time in one of our galleries. This is a permanent exhibition. We have an ASL interpreter, which we built in this program, and pretty much every month we have ASL interpreters on site to help us facilitate, to help us provide access without this access being requested. So I'm essentially doing a story time activity here with our, that is our mammoth replica. We're talking about prehistory in this instance. This is one of our touch tables. So because we have a folk life center at History Miami, we also happen to have a large collection of musical instruments. And whenever possible, we essentially laid out this collection, which takes about 4 tables, an entire gallery space, and it ranges anyway from claves to a piano. So we put all this out, and our museum educator staff, they essentially engage with families and children and teach them how to play this instrument. This is Nilka, one of our museum educators, and in her hand is a Peruvian quijada, which is the junkie doll that you make music by rattling, by essentially banging with your hand. And so this particular interactive is very popular whenever we have it out. So this image, I found my calling in this profession, working with teenagers, which not everybody likes, which I understand. And as previously of being the assistant director, I was the public programs manager for History Miami for almost a decade. So I got to work with different audiences, families, children, adults, youth. But before that, I was a Team Miami project coordinator for History Miami, and in that environment, I got to learn that I actually truly enjoy working with youth, particularly teenagers. So the picture right behind me is of author and artist Octavia Yearwood in the opening event of a program we help host at our location, and that's the youth essentially, they are celebrating, that is sparkly apple juice, at their opening event of their exhibition, that we let them use our space for them to have this learning experience. The program is called Build Your Future, and he essentially helped them envision what their future will be like while in the museum setting.
And how we invest in communities is so varied and really depends on how a community member would like to engage with us. And so that could be like J.S. Rashid that you saw before, engaging and speaking and telling his own truth and stories. Or it could be, that we purchase cremas from a local vendor in Little Haiti, or guarapo from a fruteria in Little Havana. And we also believe always in the spirit of partnership, but we also believe in always compensating people for their time. And so we always make sure to offer an honorarium. We also try to work as a resource for the community. So during the pandemic, we co-created a virtual program series called Sip of History with Gabriel Urrutia, who is a local author and mixologist, in a time when the hospitality industry in Miami was heavily impacted by COVID. And people were seeking community elsewhere. And so as part of the program, we engaged with speakers from all over the United States to celebrate Miami and its diversity, while also shedding light on the impact of the pandemic had on our communities. So pictured here is Gabriel Urrutia on the right-hand side in conversation with Angel Gomez. And so he is the founder of Tremendo Garnish, which is a local garnish company produced in Miami. And he told his story and they created a cocktail together based on the flavors of Miami and their interests. And so there are all different ways. And while this program series was created during the pandemic and we connected with everyone virtually, we're happy to say that we have met so far twice for an in-person program series, and all the comments we received were, so great to see Gabriel in person. But yeah, it was great.
Awesome. So thank you guys both in participating in this facilitated discussion. And so I want to open the floor up not only for questions, but for perhaps conversation as time allows.
Just a reminder, if you have a question, I can run the mic to you for the recording. Please do ask your question into the microphone.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. We're neighbors. We're here from Perez Art Museum, Miami, so super close neighbors, and so really feel super connected to your presentation and your goals. So I guess selfishly, I'm asking how you mentioned diversifying the guides who lead your city tours. I'm really interested in like the minutia of that and how you did that, because I think that's such an important part of what we're also trying to do is like make sure that Miami's voices and population are represented in who are delivering our tours. So I know you referenced the photo, but how did you actually go about meeting these community stakeholders and diversifying your guides and people who are leading tours? Thanks.
Thank you for your question. So we are very lucky to have a really great group of museum educators. So they are our part-time staff. We have on average about 25 of them, and they're from all walks of life, different ages. They're from different communities, and they really work to interpret all of our museum programs. So they initially worked inside of our museum. So they were our museum gallery aides. They led our school programs. They helped facilitate our public programs. They help support events. They really do everything. And so, so much of the stories of Miami happen outside of the walls of the museum. And so we, through professional development of them, learning about their stories, their interests, Sadelka in particular, and Little Haiti, he has an architecture background, was from Little Haiti, made an architecture tour at first, but really wove in the stories of not only of Little Haiti in Miami, but also Haitian history and immigration, the impact of gentrification on the community as well. And so it's all just really tethered, and we just really hope to kind of pull out our museum educators' interests, their strengths, where we can support them in research. And so we're really lucky to have them already, but yes.
The only thing that I would add to that is through outreach. So we make ourselves available to go into the community. It's just local festivals, whether they're very small festivals or very large festivals. And we don't think about we've been all the way to the Seminole Reservation to support these festivals. So that has helped us, one, to get to know people. When you're there, in a festival, you can meet 500 people, you can meet 8,000 people. So we get to have conversations with these folks and get to know who they are. We give them our business card, we tell them know who we are, what we do, and hopefully they'll let us in and invite us into their spaces, and we get to know them.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm Grace Turner. I'm from the Antiquities Corporation. I'm very glad to hear in your presentation that in reaching out, you were able to recognize and identify and include the Bahamian migrant community, because for us here in the Bahamas, we are still very much aware that Bahamian migrants were some of the earlier migrants who helped to build Miami. And quite often, as you mentioned in the earlier presentation in the museum, that was totally left out. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we got a call here in the Bahamas. There were about 50 buildings in the historic Coconut Grove that was established by Bahamian immigrants. These houses were to be demolished, and we had to make the case for them not to be demolished. And we got the response that most of them, there were about 10 that may have been too far gone to be saved, but our presentation helped to preserve most of those structures. So I'm very glad to know that that community is still being remembered and recognized now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. And actually, to your point, yes, the Charles Avenue neighborhood in Coconut Grove was a historic Bahamian neighborhood. And they very well did help led the effort to build the city of Miami before it was a city and incorporated, and really create the community of Coconut Grove. When I met J.S. Rashid, who spoke about his story in Coconut Grove, he we initially supported his effort before he led tours for us in Grove Heritage Day, which celebrated the Bahamian impact to the community of Coconut Grove. And so he activated the whole neighborhood. We were in the historic churches hearing from elders talk about the community that unfortunately is being gentrified, and the historic buildings, some of them have been removed and they're empty lots or white boxes. And so we were really happy to support and then deepen our relationship with him and the community as well.
I'll go here.
Thank you for your presentation. I have basically two comments. A couple of years back, before COVID, when you had the MAC conference in Florida, I went. So they did a very good, in-depth tour of Coconut Grove. When I went to Miami-Dade as a youngster, I also had a friend living in Coconut Grove, so I frequented that area very much. And so it was good to just be refreshed of that whole area and to hear how much the Bahamians were being honored for their work in Coconut Grove. About how much does it cost you to run your museum? You open it, it's open every day, and you have a lot of staff and help?
It is not open every day.
No? Okay.
We open Thursday through Sunday, 10 to 4. I'm sorry, Wednesday, COVID schedule. Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 4 till Saturdays, and 12 to 4 on Sundays. History Miami has a budget of a little over $6 million a year. And we have 20 plus part-time staff and close to 40 full-time staff.
Sounds like you do a lot. So.
We try.
The education department of 4.
That is true, and an education department of 4.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering about, you spoke to the tours, are you recording those tours? Do they want to be recorded to share online so that people that aren't in Miami can have access to it and can learn a bit more? And also, do you just do oral histories of the people in the area, like the older folks or just whomever may want to speak to it? Also
I'm going to take the oral history part, and I'm going to let Hana talk about the tours. So we have a program called Miami Stories that essentially, it's a recording booth that goes around town. It's been to Pam on a few occasions. We go to museums, communities, festivals, schools, it doesn't matter where. And through our folklore, essentially, oral histories are collected in all these locations, and they're transcribed and preserved into a cloud that then researchers that come into a research center are able to listen, they're able to study. So hopefully that will be an effort in which we're preserving Miami stories as generations leave us and new generations come.
And then in regarding recording tours, we do not record our tours currently. However, a lot of the people that we engage with, we also share their contacts with our folklorist as well to hopefully capture their oral histories or however they want to participate with us and be remembered. The band leader, Langston Longley, that we saw a couple slides ago, who was the band leader for Bahamas Junkanoo, had passed away this past year, unfortunately, just a couple months after that Coconut Grove tour. But we had a long relationship with him as a museum, and he was our artist in residence, one of the first ones through our Folk Life Center. The fourth one, and now we're at, I think, 29, yes. So we were really appreciative of his support of our museum, and we're able to document and collect, I believe, one of the costumes.
We have a few of his costumes. That's actually one of the residencies I got to work on as a public programs manager. We have a few of his costumes in our collection. On top of that, we have his oral history. We have records of how he, essentially, the group of the Junkanoo group, how they built the costumes, how to use the instruments, etc.
I'm sorry, what was his name?
Langston Longley.
Langston?
Hello, thanks for your presentation. It was really wonderful. So you mentioned that it has only been recently that you have modified your program to incorporate stories of, minority groups that wasn't really being told in your museum. Did you face any challenges with, developing the educational content in that way by incorporating those marginalized groups? And I do recall that recently there have been some, debates surrounding the teaching of certain histories, for example, like critical race theory and, Black history. Have you been able to incorporate certain elements of history that has been, considered, not acceptable or can cause possible segregation? And what are some of the challenges you face in incorporating those histories?
We were very lucky to have a director of education who's currently not with us, who just believed in the work. It was with her hiring almost 8 years ago that she spent with us that we make this shift. She was a principal in a previous life, not just in Miami, but also in Chicago. And she understood school curriculum. She understood the idea of having difficult conversations. She understood the process of not shying away from those conversations and how to arm, if you will, how to teach our museum educators to have those conversations. So we do a lot of professional development with our people. We meet with them once a month, and essentially, whether it's through a workshop, through sample, tours, through how to use our collection, our education collection in the galleries, we practice and we look into scenarios that could possibly happen, because when the visitors walk in, we get all kinds of people from all walks of life. So we want to be able to not put our people in difficult situations that they're not armed to answer or they're not prepared to discuss. So we do a lot of professional development with the folks that we hire.
And just to add a little bit to that, she also taught us that this work is messy sometimes, and we're not going to always get it right. We're going to make mistakes, but to own it, to apologize, to continue doing the work, because it's important work to tell, the whole story of Miami's history and communities.
We're also not afraid to say, we don't know that. I have a background in history. That doesn't mean that I know everything there is to know about Miami's history. There's always something to learn, right? We're not afraid to say, you know what, I don't know much about that fact. Let me look into it and get back to you. Let me ask somebody else.
Morning. I really like the talk. What I wanted to ask is, how do you as an institution remain motivated in this type of community outreach and community partnership, especially if, say, for example, the people who are currently very motivated and very invested in doing this type of work, if you were to not be in this position, or in, say, for example, a different institution that isn't as motivated, how do you ensure that there is some equity in how this type of programming and this type of approach to outreach continues?
Personally, I believe in the work we do. I'm gonna quote Chippy Morales, those of Pam over in the back. I got to work with Chippy Morales for over a year, many lives ago. And she used to tell me, Suarmis, you drink the Kool-Aid. So I truly believe that museums can be a place of change. They can inspire. I truly believe that we can create memories. People come to our museum and they go, oh, well, I visited in 4th grade. Do you still have that trolley? I haven't been in 20 years, but do you still have that yellow trolley that, the thing buzzes and whatnot? And we go, yeah, we still have it. I can't believe you remember that. That was 30 years ago. You came to visit. Museums can be those spaces. And I think that if us, as museum professionals, we truly, truly believe in the work that we do and we back it up. And in addition to that, we also have to be willing to say, you know what, I think I need to learn, right? In order to do what I do, I need to learn a little bit more. I work for a really long time, mainly with children, with families. And I didn't know much about sensory. And so we went in and we studied, and we visit other places, talk to other people, for example, that for our sensory program, and to the point that it allows us to create a space and a program that served the community we were not serving at a time, at least not adequately. So I think believing in what we do probably has to do a little bit, and everybody that we work with at History Miami, we truly try our best to put our best foot forward.
And I just want to echo what Suarmis said. You have to believe in the work, and you have to, really want to have a love for learning. I have been on a Miami River cruise, 30 times already, but every time I learn something different depending on who the participants are that day. There's so much information sharing, so much community building on our tours as well amongst participants. Not only is a tour guide sharing or our community stakeholders, but our audience is, members of Miami's communities. And so we learn so much about their connections to the space and place as well, their own personal histories. And so it's a really beautiful relationship building moment on our tours as well.
Thank you so much. And actually, I think you may have preempted my question with what you just said. I want to congratulate you on the presentations. And I am impressed over the fact that, and I must admit I came in a bit late, but I got this gist of presenting a Bahamian story in this Bahamian community. And I look at you and I hear you and I don't think I can readily identify a Bahamian connection. And so I wonder, but yet still I see you present it with passion. I see you present it with great interest. I mean, you're really into it. How did that come about? What about it that makes you, that stirs your own emotions, and that goes to both of you, that makes you own up to this and really want to transmit it and really want to preserve it? Because what the museum is doing, of course, is preserving a history, and it's preserving a history that's valuable. You obviously can find and identify some value in that. How did that come about?
Thank you. I think so much of Miami, we're such a diverse population and we all have different stories to tell, and where we're from. I was born and raised in Miami, but my mother immigrated from Japan, and my father is British Indian. And so that's just everyone's story. We all have different stories of how we came to make Miami home. And I think finding connection in those stories of, how we all came to call this space and place home, all honoring our heritage, our, folkways, our interests, our dislikes. I think it's just building communities, not only in the things that, the commonalities we have, but also in all the different ways and spaces that we live in, I think.
I think that what I can add to that is I'm Cuban, born in Havana, Cuba. Like Jen mentioned, I mean, I came not to Miami. I went to Boston, Massachusetts when I left Cuba. And we eventually moved down to Miami after living up in the north for a year. We all somehow, there are Miamians in Miami who have been born and raised in Miami and lived in Miami their entire life. But most people that live in Miami, that's not their story. And it's in the similarities, I think, that brings us together. In Miami, you can go to a festival and see, a Puerto Rican performance and a Bahamian performance. And you can see a Chinese dance performance, all within the same space. And somehow, socially and culturally, Miami has just sort of made that work. I think that Miami might be an example 10 years down the road for anthropological and social studies, because you leave, let's just look at Florida as a state, right? You leave Miami and you are looking at a very different landscape. So we are uniquely placed, whether because we're closer down to the Caribbean, Latin America, whatever that might be. People come, and for the most part, people stay.
Can I throw that question to Jennifer as well? You don't work at History Miami right now, but you have remained passionate and connected to the work that they're doing. So what keeps you connected?
I think in addition to kind of believing in the people that do the work there, I lived in Miami for quite a while, actually, about 10 years. And I find Miami can be a really deeply alienating place as someone who was not raised there. And so I think this goes back a little bit to the conversation about tourism and turnover and gentrification in some ways. And so what you find quite readily is that it's within these like pockets of cultural community that you actually get to feel Miami in some really robust ways that kind of challenge what's on the surface of the thing. And so I think that the work that History Miami in particular is doing about creating space for telling those kinds of stories and doing so in a way that understands that the limitations of the museum is that flexibility is difficult in permanent exhibits, that there is only a certain kind of turnover, but the space itself needs to be activated such that it can be inclusive and it can be responsive and it can be reflexive of the challenges as the space changes and grows, but the challenges that were previously made by the institution that you're employed by, and the work that you independently have to do to redress that. And so I'm a historian by training, and my interest has always been the kinds of stories that can't be found in kind of dominant narratives. So thinking about who we need to talk to, who we need to center to get kind of the real experience of how something historically happened. And part of that is making sure that all voices are held on equal footing, rather than focusing on the voices that are either the loudest or the most readily accessible. And so I think that is some of the underpinnings of the work that you guys do, which is why anytime I get the opportunity to come back and pretend to work with these guys again, I take it. And we love you for it.
Okay, you mentioned how old Miami or that area is. More than 10,000 years or maybe older. And I know one time in the news they had these circles that they said were sacred spaces of the Indians or the native peoples. Do you know how old those were determined to be?
Around 12,000 years. Around 12,000 years. 12,000.
Oh, yeah, because I saw it in the news, but I didn't get the continued writer. So that's amazing. But I always found Miami to be a very interesting place, not only to shop, because that's the Bahamian, that was the Bahamian shopping mecca in those days, but also historically. So thank you very much.
Questions? We still have time.
It's like we have tons of questions, so we can keep going. You mentioned you have 25 educators. Are they part-time, and do you feel like obviously we're coming from a place where we're dealing with people like not being paid a living wage where they can like necessarily have a car or live very close to the museum at this point with what Miami is like. Do you feel that your museum is able to pay a living wage? I know you mentioned your big budget, and we have one too, but it doesn't necessarily always trickle down to the education department. So could you speak a little bit about your challenges in like fighting for resources internally within your organization?
So I was a museum educator at History Miami once upon a time, and so was Hana. Every year, at least since I've worked there, which is going to be about to be 14 years very soon, the senior staff, if you will, the director of the museum, which has fluctuated, we have different directors during that time, has made an effort to give a raise to everybody, but particularly the part-time staff. So we provide a raise every year, and we do our best for that to be comparable with whatever the increase of living is.
Hi, thank you so much. You're amazingly creative in the community outreach and activities that you guys do. And you've talked about the budget that you have, but where does the funding come from?
That's a great question. So the museum, within our budget at the Education Center, there is a pot of money that is allocated to outreach. But whenever possible, we do our best to leverage partnerships. So whether we participate at a program the library already has available, whether we are part of a festival activation at our parks and recs, whether we go to schools or whatnot. However, we do have a budget dedicated to outreach. Not to say that is enough. We do our best to do to write grants and seek sponsorships for these activities. The one that we had in the picture, Home for History, we partnered with Jackson Hospital to essentially some of those resources that we provided, they gave to us.
For me, I love it that you are leveraging your community partnerships to bring resources to the Smithsonian, to History Miami, I'm sorry. and I'm really curious about that part because you have to be really intentional about reaching out to the Seminole community. So how did that come about and what does that look like now?
We have a staff person in the Education Center that identifies as a Native American. And she made an effort to bridge that relationship. We went there to their space. We walked their exhibitions. We heard about their stories. We listened to what they do, et cetera, to how they're growing, what their future plans are, through the relation that she built, essentially. And then hopefully they'll come to visit us. And we just got a date confirmed. So they're in April. Their museum staff is coming to our museum. So through those relationship building opportunities, we were invited to have a space at their festival this year.
Any other audience questions? We still have about 5 minutes. Is there anything that you didn't get to share in your presentation that you wanted to say? No, I think
Yeah. Do you collect from community members, like any objects or anything related to like their oral histories or any like just random community collecting?
We do. So the Miami Stories program, for example, comes with, so we collect an image aside from the story, but I guess because we already mentioned it, I'm gonna talk about it. So our Folklight program, our Artist in Residence program, started, I think it was 2011. And we, at this point, have worked with close to 30 artists. And in those efforts, we have collected items from their traditions, whether it's a costume from Lansdowne Lonely or flamenco shoes or an instrument that was used by Leandro Rojas, who's a Cuban tres guitar builder. So we make an effort to essentially add to our collection whenever we work with different people. I mean, right now, History Miami, we have over 2 million images, and we have over 37,000 3D artifacts in our collection.
All right, well, if there are more questions. We're not done yet. Sorry. No, it's fine, it's wonderful.
It's a pretty short question. I'm just curious about, and I might have missed it in part of the presentation, I'm just curious about how do you go about, you say in your artist residency programs afterwards, you collect at least one item from them afterwards. How do you guys go about that? Is it an item that is gifted to the museum afterwards, or is it like a intentional like purchase after the residency program? Because it's always like, sometimes I think for me personally, as a person who works in an institution, sometimes it feels like there's like a bridge you're walking between the ethics of I'm providing the space for somebody to create something, and also it's transactional in that sense of, am I actually giving them what it's worth, or am I just taken it from them because I have given them a opportunity. So that's just a thought.
That's a great question. So all the artists that we work with get paid for the residency, which is a multitude of programs that we put together in the span of 3 to 4 months. And those programs vary at audiences. So there's a school program, there's a community program, there is a family day, for example, and there is a program geared towards an adult audience. So in this relationship that we build with them, we also try to do something that's beneficial to them. So whether it is a marketing photo shoot or social media presence or getting access to a particular festival that they haven't been able to in the past. And your question was particularly about how we come about collecting these items. Some of them are gifted to us. Some of them we purchase. So it really depends on the communication, the understanding at the time that we come to the table. Some of these artists have worked with History Miami for a really long time, and they just come back to work with us again. Some of them are brand new relationships that we are invited into somebody's house to see what they have. Part of the residency, at some point, it also involved an exhibition. So we would go into these folks' houses and look at what they had available and, what did they want to exhibit, what story they wanted to tell through their items. And then we sort of try to figure it out. And by we, at that point, I mean our folk life creator. Try to figure out how to tell the story in the small stage that we have in a folk life gallery. While the residency was happening, all those items were on display.
Thank you. Such a wonderful presentation. This is kind of continuing on off the last conversation about making sure you're walking that line and making sure it's equitable and not extractive. This is kind of a continuation question. What are some of your goals in the future to do even more? Are there partnerships throughout the state of Florida or nationwide? What would that look like for you?
That's a great question. Well, I think we'll continue deepening this work. So there are so many communities in Miami, and we're not perfect. We're still building relationships. We're still, seeking community members who want to work with us, engage with us, tell their stories. And so there's still a lot of work to be done, especially in our city tours programming. And so we focused on a few neighborhoods like Coconut Grove, like Little Haiti, like Little Havana, where there's a lot of interest because those communities have such a loud voice. I think that those are the kind of the main communities you think about when you think about Miami, but there's so many smaller communities that have been there for generations that we want to explore and build relationships with. But so there's still work to be done.
All right, well, we're at time, so if we can give another round of applause for Jennifer Garcon, Suarmis Travieso, and Hana Squires.